if you look at the side bend, when I say about that, so we talked about how straight the mast was in the boat, side to side. But the side bend is whether the middle of the sail pokes to windward or not, or to leeward. So this would be a straight mast. This would be sagging to leeward, and this would be poking to windward. And what you're looking for, in generically speaking, is a little bit of side bend for get power. You can sort of see the shape of the sail. And then as you poke it to windward, it kind of twists. It's kind of the equivalent of twisting the main open and spilling power. The top of the mast goes off. You're losing power there. Whereas in this case, if it's sagging to leeward, the top of the mast is kind of scooping the wind to weather. You're looking for power. Now, on a practical stance here, when we sail J22s, we spend a lot of time on side bend. Everything we do with tuning on the water, when we're changing the shrouds around, the uppers and lowers on the water, is all about this side bend. We spend all our time trying to get that side bend right. On the J24, because the mast is fixed, the butt's fixed, and then you got the partners, and then you got your spreaders and your hounds, you got four things kind of holding that thing in column. We've found that there's a little bit of side bend you can get, but for the most part, we don't spend a lot of time looking at side bend on a J24. I think it's important in a thistle. I think it's important in a lightning. And it probably is important in a J24. You just can't get there. The mast is too stiff, and you have too much of a lever arm with the deck. Anyway, in answer to your question, Scott, we'll talk about the rig a little bit. Go ahead. These are the forces, in more graphically, that are changing what you do on the rig. So you have a certain amount of pre-bend, and that pre-bend is because you have uppers pulling down, so it's compression bend. You have spreaders sweeping back, so you can see they're aft of what an upper would be if it was straight. So that's pushing the mast this way. And the uppers also affect how much forestay tension you have. So for example, on a J24, in lighter air, for the most part, we want as much forestay sag as we can possibly get. So what we do is we ease these off until the leeward starts just to go loose or just a little bit tight. And what that tells you, if you made it any looser than that, so the leeward was actually loose, it would start to fall off to leeward. But since it's just tight, you're not having it fall off to leeward, yet you have the maximum amount of forestay sag. J22 is another good example of that. We tune it exactly the same way. We set the uppers so that they're just barely taut. If you loosen them another half turn, they just start to go soft. And that's all about getting your forestay tension right and for the right amount of pre-bend. So the question was, okay, I had just mentioned a minute ago that in J24 we actually get the lowers tighter than the uppers in heavy air. And he said, well, aren't we then pulling this center of the mast aft and therefore straightening the mast, doing exactly the opposite of what we just talked about? I just spent my whole first half of this thing talking about how much pre-bend you wanted so that you could flatten out the sail. And now I'm talking about pulling the lowers super tight. So anybody have a guess why that would be? You're going to have to wait then until the end of the presentation because that gets answered. Okay, so your spreader sweep, so I'll come back to it later. The spreader sweep gives you pre-bend as well. So if you had if the spreader was all the way back here, you gave even more pre-bend. Go ahead. Just so you have a uniform way of measuring the spreader, we just take a piece of line between the two spreaders and you measure between the end of the track. Pretty much what you're doing is go down one. Oop, maybe not. Yeah, so you're measuring between the back of the track and the spreader. And just for consistency, that's also how we measure the pre-bend when we're measuring. We take the halyard. When I measure pre-bend, I pull it down to the gooseneck. I'm measuring from the back of the track to the front of the main halyard. And that's because you got to pick something to measure from. At least you know that the track is in the same spot, and that's a consistent point of reference. So we actually have a little jig that goes in here, fits into the mast. It's a jig being just a little piece of plastic that we kind of have a little line on where it pushes into the back of the track. We tape it to a spinnaker pole, and you push it up here, and you can measure all kinds of things. You can measure, well, it's hard to measure this because you don't have a string across, but you can measure the pre-bend that way. But I find too often that people measure those things, and they look up their mast, say, oh, we got 2 inches of pre-bend. And I don't think your eye is calibrated that well. You don't know. Your eye is very good at relative measurements, or if you had a mark up there, you might be able to tell the difference between something. But so what we do is we put the marks right on that little feeler gauge, draw the halyard tight, and we stick it up there, and we can measure to probably within a 1/4 inch or so of what our pre-bend is. All right, so for the first section of this presentation, the main thing that everything is about is making sure your boat is symmetric, it's balanced, and your luff curve or your luff hollow on your Genoa matches your sail, and you're setting up the rig so that happens. The next one. So once again, everything we do in tuning in the end is about those 2 things. You bend your mast, you're going to make a flatter sail. You make it straight. You make it straight, and you're going to make more curve in it. And just the opposite on the Genoa. You make it sag more, you're going to have more curve in it. You make it just straight, you've pulled out the luff curve. So that's that ends the very first part of this.